Good day. Urban fantasy is a genre that, while successful, can still a decade on conjure up thoughts of sparkly vampires, lame werewolves, and planks of wood in the shape of boring teenage girls. But it was not always such. In the days long ago, vampires were sexy babes in leather and red guys that fought Cthulhu. After the twilight of the urban fantasy, one stood. He remained steadfast through the genre that preyed upon the weak. And unto this, Larry Correa, destined to wear the jeweled crown of urban fantasy upon a troubled brow. Let me tell you of the days of high adventure. Monster Hunter International. I reviewed it a while back, but today we're getting back into it, and for those that may have missed that video, MHI takes place in a world where vampires are still nasty bastards, werewolves are still insane bestial killers, and they're not even the worst. The world at large is ignorant that the world they inhabit is filled with monsters and elder things. The governments of the world are overwhelmed by the tide of monsters, so they seek the aid of mercenaries called Monster Hunters, and the greatest of them all are Monster Hunter International. The first two novels of the Monster Hunter series chronicle the rise of Owen Zostova Pitt. He is a bit of a chosen one and is 350 pounds of badass that can shoot and balance checkbook. Yes, our 12-gauge shotty-wielding hero is also an accountant, kind of like Larry Correa himself. These novels are from the first-person perspective and have some sweet adventures in them. Larry Correa was smart. He wanted to keep the Monster Hunter universe fresh and wanted to ensure that people didn't get tired of Mr. Pitt's antics, and thus for book 3, the novel we're reviewing today, he changed not only the protagonist, but also the perspective. Now, we've got a third-person perspective with a few first-person journal flashbacks. After Monster Hunter Alpha, Mr. Correa would keep his MHI universe fresh by swapping out Owen with other characters from time to time, and in his latest book, he goes all the way back to the 70s for some monster killing action. Monster Hunter Alpha was published in 2011 and was supposed to be accessible to new readers. And it mostly is. Having read book 2 in sequence, I was able to get more of what was going on. And hey, don't read/play/watch the third installment first. To avoid spoilers, I will not touch on the finer details until later in the review, but a major spoiler for book 1 appears in the synopsis for this book, so whatever. The novel features two main protagonists, Earl Harbinger and Heather Kirkhonen. Earl is a werewolf, spoiler for book 1. You learn this literally on the first page of this book, but it was a major reveal in book 1, so yeah. Earl first appeared in book 1, and it was a big reveal that a major monster hunter was himself a monster. Earl is kind of sort of the boss, but he prefers to be outside doing the fighting instead of the boring HQ stuff. Earl Harbinger has been fighting monsters for over 100 years, and the novel delves into his backstory through a journal that he is writing. In the MHI universe, pretty much all werewolves turn evil due to their enhanced senses and have to be put down. Earl is one of the only werewolves known who is not an evil bastard. His journal chronicles how this came to be. Earl's character is bloody amazing. He don't take no crap from no one, and is best described as Clint Eastwood, but with more hair. He is mean most of the time, but will soften when he needs to, and he carries a bloody Tommy gun for the close encounters of the hairy kind. Heather Kirkhonen is the audience surrogate character and is a small-town cop. She is there so that the plot and backstory can be explained without bloody info dumps. She is a pretty great female protagonist. She is competent but never takes over or makes a fool of Earl and earns her way through the novel. The plot deals with Earl going to a small Michigan town to track down an old enemy of his, Nikolai. Nikolai is another werewolf that can kind of control himself but has a split personality, so he is constantly at war with his furry side. Earl is called to this small town because one of his old associates has information on how to find Nikolai. In the middle of all this, we have werewolves attacking in a Dawn of the Dead sort of way, for every person bit comes back as a werewolf. Can Earl and the townspeople stand against the furry menace? All told, this is my favorite of all the Monster Hunter International books. Its plot is pretty satisfying and has some great personal stakes for all the characters involved. And we see a lot of character growth with Earl over the course of the novel, and I prefer Earl as the protagonist, as Owen Pitt, while not a bad dude, comes off as a bit pretentious in his novels, and I was never a fan of the chosen one concept in the first place. Earl, on the other hand, can be a bit of a grumpy old man from time to time, but never does he act like the world owes him anything, nor does it feel like he thinks he's better than everyone, which is kind of the vibe I get from Pitt. And we get a really good villain scene late in the book that left me completely shocked. The action in this book is still as awesome as the previous two novels, but since the scope of this novel is a little more limited than the previous two, I found it more visceral. And there's a really awesome segment where the townspeople hold up in a school with personally owned firearms and they face a werewolf siege without any federal help. Speaking of, Larry Correia is a libertarian, but he is not political for the most part. He is not a fan of the federal government of the United States and will often show them as incompetent, but he does not strawman them, and one of the side villains is a Fed, but said Fed is given a tragic backstory to explain why he is bad, instead of Larry just saying, Fed bad. The main villain of the novel also has a bit of a tragic backstory, which gives him much more depth than just saying, he a bad guy. By far, this is Larry's best novel, as it gets the character and setting right. And I'm not just saying that because this is more or less aliens with furries. Now that those normies are gone to go by the novel, let's dig deep. Our heroes are Earl and Heather. Our villains are the Alpha Werewolf and Nikolai, and a few humans, a corrupt monster hunting organization, a corrupt monster control bureau agent, and a dark sorceress. Each villain has their own contributions to the plot, with the Alpha Werewolf being the ultimate villain behind the furry apocalypse. The dark sorceress has teamed up with the Alpha Werewolf and provides some magical muscle. The corrupt humans are mostly a nuisance, but they do pull their weight in the plot. When Earl rolls into town, he only really thinks he's going to be taking down Nikolai. Nikolai was a werewolf that worked with the KGB, and he and Earl fought during Nam, and a few of Earl's friends got chomped by him. Earl is the king of the werewolves, and it's due to his might that other werewolves try and mostly fail to leave humans alone. Earl's policies are more guidelines instead of strict laws, hence why in Book 1 of MHI, a werewolf tries to chomp Pitt. Earl is afraid that Nikolai is trying to usurp his rule, but surprise, evil sorcerer! Said sorcerer takes Earl's wolf powers via an amulet, leaving him human for the first time in decades. Heather is a beat cop and has to investigate some strange happenings, and wouldn't you know it, one of her fellow cops gets chomped and is turned into a werewolf, but Earl is able to save her by getting there just in time. Around the midpoint of the novel, werewolves start attacking the town, and Earl and Heather team up to get the townspeople bunkered down in the local school. During all of this, Heather gets chomped and starts to turn, and at one point even eats her dog. This is a well-written segment and really shows the horror of turning into a furry. Despite the degeneracy, Earl doesn't want to blast her because Heather is a hot, thick redhead, so he just locks her in a special werewolf cage he carries just in case. Kinda kinky for the first date, but well, Earl's a furry after all. Turns out the werewolves they're fighting are special werewolves. They're zombies too! But Early Boy hatches a plan and teams up with a guy even more dangerous than he is. And old Finn. Who knew Finn's loves Michigan? Earl and the Finn use a snowplow to literally chop up all the zombified furries. It's by far the most epic battle in the entire novel. So after solving the mystery of who's actually behind all the furriation, it's now time to take down the big bad, which is the Alpha Werewolf. By this point in the novel, Heather is now a Lycan, aka a werewolf that keeps their humanity and can change at will. The old Finn has a magical Mosin Nagant rifle with super werewolf killer bullets that kind of takes down the Alpha Werewolf, but he's able to heal. Eventually, Earl is knocked down a mine shaft and almost dies. But then Nikolai shows up and then gives Earl his werewolf powers back. That is really awesome. I love it when a villain can become heroic for at least a couple seconds because it shows there is more dimension than just evil. As you'd expect, Earl kicks the crap out of the Alpha Werewolf, but the sorceress escapes. Another neat thing about the end of the book is Earl gets a lot of his humanity back as he goes through this adventure and wants to get busy with Heather, but not all is well. For you see, if you become a monster in the Monster Hunter universe, you have to work for the government for an undisclosed period of time to prove your loyalty to humanity, and so after a few days of sexy times, the feds show up and take Heather away. The end. Holy crap, was this good! Larry, by this point, had improved his craft tremendously, and thus we had a far more complex plot than what had been seen in the first two books. His characters were more believable and more enjoyable to read about, and on top of that, his action sequences were much more complex and understandable, and a lot less muddy in places. He kept the stakes high, but not ridiculous. This was important because in the previous novel, he had a great old one get a nuke to the face. Korea was able to raise the stakes from that, but in a way that left a path open for other novels to raise them higher without it getting stupid. You know, I'm looking at you, Marvel and DC, when it comes to that. Larry also depowered Earl in a way that wasn't bullshitty. Earl needed to lose those werewolf powers, not only so he wouldn't solo the entire book, but also so that he could have a little character arc too. I love that Earl was still Earl even without his powers. I also love that by book 3, Larry was walking back his potential Mary Sue tendencies, and the hero's eventual victory was all the more enjoyable because of it. If you haven't read this novel in a while, I highly recommend cracking it open once again, because this is a cracking good read. And so I'm General Lotz, wishing you good Monster Hunter Bloodlines, and good Monster Hunter Legion, whatever makes you happy. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing, and please consider leaving a like or a comment, as the algorithm desires your soul. And I want to thank all those fans who have supported this channel, both past and present.